You know, we still get plenty of questions on this, and I can really understand why, because for every county, it's going to be a little bit different. And a lot of times it just seems like one of those topics that just should really be straightforward, but for whatever reason, it isn't. So we'll talk about travel reimbursements and the things that State Board of Accounts looks for when we audit you for travel. With the exception of state-called meetings, which we'll be going over, reimbursement should be based on what is allowed in your county's travel policy. And your travel policy is what we, the State Board of Accounts, will look to when we're testing whether or not your travel is allowable. And really, the more detailed your policy is, the better we are able to see if you're in compliance with it. And more importantly, the more detailed your policy is, the more able that everybody, because you've got a lot of people in your county, a lot of different situations, so the more detailed and the more clear it is, then those people will understand what they can and can't do for travel. And I think we went over a little bit about fraud and communication, and having things clearly detailed out is one of those things that will help prevent even fraud in this area. That doesn't mean that once you have a policy that everything is just going to be clear, because you're going to run into situations that are not addressed in that policy. And Tammy and I get calls all the time because they'll ask us if certain things are okay to do in travel. And for example, we'll get somebody who may want to be reimbursed for overnight lodging. And we'll say, well, is it for county business and is it in your travel policy? They'll be like, well, yeah, but our travel policy says 50 miles away. But they're going to go 45. They're only 45 miles away, but they're going to be there late at night. The weather's bad. Can they get reimbursed for it? And that's the one thing that we'll say to you, well, are extenuating circumstances addressed in your policy? And sometimes you'll go like, no, and we'll say, well, okay, this is one of those things then that you need to get clarified for your policy. We know that there's always going to be circumstances that arise that you just can't think of everything. But you do have the opportunity, once these things occur, to go ahead and change, adapt your policy to address these things. So State Board of Accounts is not really concerned about what you choose to reimburse, as long as it's the basic premise should always be, is it for county business and is it reasonable? If you say we're going to give per diem of $1,000 a day, we would all love that, but that's not reasonable. So we're going to question something like that. But as long as you have it on a reasonable basis, we're not going to question you. And again, if we do find where something doesn't match or where the policy is really unclear, if we find where something doesn't match a policy, then we'll have an exception for that occurrence. If we find where the policy is not clear, then we're going to have an exception with the policy itself. So we do distinguish between those two things. So address those things before they become an issue in your policy. Your policy, of course, should be in writing. This can be through an ordinance or part of the employee personnel policy. And it should just be in some way a public document so that it's accessible to everyone and readily available. And again, it needs to be detailed and updated as needed. So what are some of the common things that may be addressed? From our earlier example, the distance from a location when an employee will be considered in travel status and so eligible to spend the night at a hotel. What types of extenuating circumstances may be an exception for this, and what approval and documentation would be required to allow for any exceptions. Need to consider that. The number of hours in a day on a work assignment an employee must be before they're eligible for something like meal reimbursement. For example, at the state, we are allowed subsistence per diem while in travel status, but how much depends on what time of the day we are considered in the travel status and whether or not it's same-day travel or overnight travel. So those are some of the things you might want to consider. Cost of hotel rooms. Is there a limit that will be reimbursed per night? And are there different room rates for different parts of the state? And if by some chance there's a conference and there needs to be a variation, what kind of approvals, what kind of documentations do you need to show for that? Will there be other things that are reimbursed, such as parking fees, valet service, room service, internet service? You need to just kind of think through what are the common type things that you run into. Mileage is a big one. There's no particular mileage rate that has been set by statute for all the local units of government. The mileage rate is with the discretion of the county. Meal reimbursement. Will this be an actual cost or per diem? If it's for actual cost, is there a limit? Is there a limit for different meals? At the state, we have $13 for dinner, and it's $6.50 for lunch and breakfast. So, is it permissible to establish a reasonable per diem rate intended to cover travel expenses other than hotel and mileage costs? And payment of per diem can be in lieu of receipts, but you may want to require. Even though you have per diem, you might want to require receipts. And this might be helpful for things like making a determination whether your per diem is reasonable, just, tracking that type of thing. Might want to cut it back or whatever. If you have per diem in the policy should clearly indicate which type of expenses, in addition to meals, are included in the rate versus other types of costs. It could be that you're saying that for your per diem is enough, it's $30 a day. If you have valet parking, that's going to be included in that rate. So you have to consider those things, but you might say, well, we'll allow you to have internet in your room or something like that. That is an additional expense where we'll want to see that as on a receipt or as part of your hotel bill or something like that, and we'll pay that in addition to the hotel rate or to a per diem. The policy should cover a proportionate reduction in the per diem rate when meals are provided by an outside party. So if you have a conference and they're providing lunch, then you might want to consider, okay, you get per diem, how much is it going to be reduced by for that lunch? I know there's not probably a lot in the way of out-of-state travel, but that also has to be considered. Will out-of-state result in differing reimbursement rates for hotels, per diems, actual costs for meals? Go to Washington, D.C., it's going to be a lot different than it is here in Indiana. So, and again, if somebody's actually lucky enough to go out of town for travel, airline costs, car rental costs, And you might want to address who in the county makes reservations. And do you have a specific company that you work with or anything like that? The county might want to consider adopting a policy allowing for travel advances for such things like airline tickets, registration. However, when you do this, and this big warning, you also want to include in the policy who becomes liable for the costs and under what circumstances if the travel does not occur. You know, if it's the county says, oh, we need you here instead, they're taking responsibility, I would, you know, most likely assume on that. But if there is an illness, what's going to happen? So those are things you want to consider. When you consider any of the rates, you can look towards the state or the federal rates for reasonableness. That's kind of helpful for you, but again, you're under no obligation to follow either one of these. And do keep in mind that there are certain income reporting requirements if mileage reimbursement is more than the federal rate. So if you go more than the federal rate, you'll need to contact the IRS to see their requirements. An area that we're frequently asked about is sales tax on hotels. There's a lot of confusion here because what is standard practice runs contrary to what the Indiana Department of Revenue has determined is appropriate. Many of you will pay for your hotel bill with either a county credit card or with a county check written in advance of your arrival at the hotel. And by doing so, the hotel will often exclude the cost of the sales tax. This thinking goes back to that governmental units are eligible for an exemption from state sales tax. And when an employee pays out of his or her own pocket, even if it's for a county purchase, that purchase will not be exempt from a sales tax. So thus we go and say, okay, we'll use the county's credit card or a check from the county. However, this sales tax exemption is not really a blanket exemption to governmental units. There is a bulletin from the Indiana Department of Revenue. That's bulletin number 4, May 2010. And you can find this bulletin at www.in.gov/DOR. And it's under Reference Library. One qualifier is that the purchase must be invoiced directly to the unit of government, which is what we've been talking about. The other is that a purchase is used primarily for a traditional government function, which that sounds reasonable. You know, government functions are, you know, things like police and fire protection and the functions that you perform in your office, so it makes sense. Then it goes on, and it primarily means if the purchase is used more than 50% of the time in the performance of that function. So it clarifies it even a little bit more. Our understanding is that the Department of Revenue has determined that a person staying at a hotel, even when for a business function, is a purchase for an individual benefit. And so the sales tax applies. Now, there have been hotels that have been audited, and based on these audits, they are now including sales tax in the hotel bills of governmental employees on government business, irregardless of what payment type's being made. And we've gotten calls about that. The Department of Revenue is the one who is responsible for the proper application of sales tax. So really, if you have questions regarding it, you need to contact them. But what I want to let you know is that we will not take audit exception to you paying sales tax for hotel bills. We are not going to take that exception, okay? And we've also had the question, if you go out of state and you're staying at a hotel, whether or not that will take exception for paying sales tax there. No, we will not. No matter what, when you stay at a hotel, if they charge you sales tax, we will not take exception to that reimbursement. I gave you Bulletin 4. I know that this has really been steeped in tradition about how this exemption works. There is another informational bulletin, number 10. It does apply to not-for-profits, but it really kind of explains their position, I think, a little bit more clearly. So again, it doesn't apply to you, but you might want to read it just to see how that their logic has occurred on this subject. Okay, the exception to following your county's policy is when there is a state statute that governs the amount of allowable travel reimbursement. And in those cases, the statute supersedes your local policy. So we're going to go over these. Sometimes we get calls about whether or not a meeting falls under these. If for some reason somebody's saying, I know this is a state-called meeting, but I just know it is, then they need to be providing you with that information, or if you want to take that on yourself, you can do the research or whatever. But there should be sufficient documentation, and to my knowledge, just like we send a certification letting you guys know to go ahead and pay for these claims, all of the other state-called meetings do that also. There might be an exception, though, so I wouldn't just disregard what somebody says. There's law passed or something we don't know about. Just ask them. They need to provide that documentation. The first one we'll go over is near and dear to my heart, and that's State Board of Accounts meetings. You can find the requirements under IC 5-11-14-1, and for mileage it states that the rate is determined by the fiscal body, so it's your county's mileage rate. Lodging is for each night preceding the conference. It's equal to the single room rate. And we've been asked if you can be forced to share a room. Again, there might be a county policy in effect for that, but for our state called meetings, it's the single room rate for an individual. So, but I do appreciate that a lot of you want to keep down your costs too. In the case of a one-day conference, it is allowed only for those who reside 50 miles or further from the conference. Subsistence for meals purchased while attending the conference, it's your county policy again, whether it's actual or a per diem. Payments shall be made from the general fund, and it does not need to be appropriated. Registration isn't addressed, but it's been pointed out many times that the cost of this is mostly for meals, and we haven't taken exception to the payment from the general fund. DLGF instructional meetings are under IC 6-1.1-35-3. You have the township assessors, for those who have any left, county assessors, or members of the County Property Tax Assessment Board of Appeals, county auditors, and their employees. So mileage is the state mileage rate, which is now 44 cents. Lodging is for each night preceding the session. Attendance is not less than the lodging allowance equal to the lesser of. I just love statutes sometimes. So could you just not come out and say something? Okay. The cost of a standard room rate at the hotel where the session is held, or the actual cost of lodging paid. So just like the State Board of Accounts, if it is a one-day instructional meeting, then the lodging may be paid only for those 50 miles or more away from the meeting. Subsistence that can't be less than what is allowed for state employees, but not more, again with the law, but not more than the maximum subsistence allowance permitted under the regulations of the General Service Administration for federal employees. The amount is to be established by the fiscal body per their policy. So again, it's really going to be your county's policy on it. It's just that those criteria have to be met. Parking, an allowance equal to the cost of parking at the convention site. And again, payment is from the general fund, not otherwise appropriated. Next is DLGF training, continuing education. They have slightly different rules for that. These are for the assessing officials and hearing officers for the County Property Tax Assessment Board of Appeals. Mileage and per diem is set by the DLGF under the Indiana Administrative Code, and that's Indiana Administrative Code 50 IAC 20, if in case you want to look there. But what they've come up with from that is that the mileage, the rate is set by the county fiscal body, so that's your county's policy as far as mileage, but it'll default to the state if for some reason you don't have a policy on that. And the person is entitled to travel only between the person's place of work and the training session nearest to the person's place of work. Meal and lodging, again, it's the policy set by the county unless you don't have one, and then it will default over to the states. Payments can be made from the unappropriated cumulative reassessment fund or the unappropriated general fund. Indiana Election Commission, again, that's the election boards and boards of registration and your clerks. Mileage is at the state rate for the distance that's necessarily traveled. That's nice that they put that in there so that you don't make all these side trips and stuff, get reimbursed for it. Lodging for each night preceding the conference attendance equal to the lodging allowance provided to state employees. So it's the same as the state employees again. Subsistence is by statute, it's $24. Which that does not equal the state rate. So it's just, they plucked a number out there, $24. And registration fees are allowed. Payments, again, are from the general fund without appropriation. The next one is probably the most vague yet specific one. One of those statute things. It's Attorney General called meetings, this for the prosecuting attorneys, and the code states that the expenses are necessarily incurred, what expenses are necessarily incurred by a prosecuting attorney in attending a conference, including the actual expense of transportation, together with meals and lodging, and it'll be paid from the general fund. We've gotten some calls on this. We would advise, because if you're wondering what are the different costs involved with this and everything, we would advise that you look at the attendance confirmation letter to define what all these reimbursements are for sure. If it's not there, we'll not take audit exception to using the rates as set by your county's policy. So, and finally I have down here the state rates. Lodging used to be that there was a different rate for Indianapolis than there was for everybody else. That has changed. I guess I talked to Minnie Hoskins, who's Department of Administration, And she said that they were able to make a deal with the hotels in the Indianapolis area. So all the lodging is now reimbursed at the $89 per night rate. If you go on the website for Indianapolis, it's going to say $87. Many swore that it's $89. So she said that they would get right on that. And so we'll see. But I just want to let you know that that's what the state rate is.